Morning, everyone. I hope that each of you has now arrived here with heart, body, and soul and mind. I'm Marine, I'm the program manager at NEMO, and one of the joys of this role is inviting speakers who challenge us to think ahead. And I'm especially happy to welcome now someone who has been inspiring museum professionals all around the globe for years. Elizabeth Merritt. Elizabeth has traveled a long way to be with us. She's coming from the US, where she is the Vice President for Strategic Foresight at the American Alliance of Museums and the founding director of the Center for the Future of Museums. So from being fully present in the now, let's shift our focus mindfully forward into the future, and let's join Elizabeth on her visionary exploration of how museums can engage with the future of health and well-being. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Elizabeth Merritt.
Thank you, Maureen. And I am so grateful to be with you today to spend some time exploring a future in which health and well-being could be more integrated into museums, and museums are more integrated into the future of health and well-being. As a futurist, it's my privilege to be able to help people explore all of the problems of technology, which are myriad. So while you're figuring that out, I'll start talking. Sometimes when I go and introduce myself as a futurist, the first question people have is, so what is the future going to be? And that gives me an opportunity to explain, that's not my job. Because one of the first important things to learn about foresight is futurists aren't here to predict the future. They're here to help us imagine all the different futures that could come to be. And to do that, we use a marvelous diagram called the cone of possibility. The cone of possibility encourages us to realize that while we're here in the present and we think we know all the things that can happen in the world, the further out in time we go, the more possibilities open up. And my goal as a futurist is to help you imagine what all those potential futures could be, and help you imagine the positive futures that you want to come to pass with your work. And then to come back to the present and say, all right, well, first of all, are these futures we want to exist or not to want to exist? For example, back in 2018, I imagined a future in the US in which we had a conservative president and there had been a global pandemic and nonprofits were struggling, and whoops, that actually came to pass. But most of the time, I'm helping museums imagine better futures, to say how can we move towards something we want to exist, and then to look for little seeds of those positive futures in the present, and say how can we water those seeds and help them grow. So today I have outlined a cone of possibility out into the universe, and I'm going to help you envision 3 potential futures of health, well-being, and museums. Each is going to have a dominant theme, and the dominant theme of the first is technology, how technology could help integrate health and well-being into museums. The second is human connection. Never mind the tech, what about us as human beings? How can essentially human connections drive health and well-being in museums? And the third is systems. How can we think about systematic integration of museums into the way that we provide a healthy and supportive environment for our citizens? So to do this, I am going to look for what futurists call guiding images, little pictures, those seeds of the present that we could water and grow. Let's start with the Internet of Health. This is health, well-being, and technology. How many of you have something on your wrist or on your finger like a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or an Oura Ring? Raise your hand. Great. So you're already connected to the Internet of Health and Well-being, because these are ubiquitous devices that connect our personal data to the web, and they allow that, for example, if you go into a supermarket or you go into a department store, it's very likely that they're tracking your cell phone and noticing where you're spending time and using that data to hone their marketing pitch. Yeah, and not only that, but technology is beginning to use those ubiquitous surveillance cameras to know what you're feeling. The cameras can look at your face, and an algorithm can analyze your expression and see whether you're feeling joyful or interested or excited or disgusted. So they can not only see where you're spending time, but how you're reacting to that environment emotionally. This is actually being integrated into museums. We already have people using experiments where using those surveillance cameras that maybe were only trying to make sure somebody wasn't stealing the crown jewels of France in the past. Sorry about that. And saying, well, as long as we've got this anyway, why don't we use it to see how people are thinking and feeling and reacting to the art? And this is not new. This experiment I'm showing you here, eMotion, mapping the museum experience, this is over 12 years old. They wired visitors up not only with little sensors on their hands to test galvanic skin response and see whether they were excited or calm and how they were emotionally responding. And even this long ago, they were able to map how museum visitors walked through a sample gallery and reacted to the art. More recently at the Tech Interactive, which is in San Jose, California, they wired museum visitors up with more recent technology, with things like these little sensors you can hold on your wrist, and they said, how can we test how your reaction to what you're doing in the museum affects your health and well-being? How is it affecting your pulse rate? How is it affecting your blood pressure? How is it affecting your brain waves? And how can you work with how you're responding to the art to manipulate your reactions? So these are all seeds of how this is happening now. Let's think about how this could even be more integrated. There are actually toilets now that you can buy that will monitor your output, shall we say, and send health data to your doctor saying whether there are signs of, colon cancer, blood in the stool. Well, let's think about how that could integrate with museum data. Right now, there's this marvelous experiment that unfortunately has been discontinued called Send Me. This was from the San Francisco Museum of Art. And you could text the museum and say, send me joy, send me calmness, send me love. And whatever you put in there as a noun or an adjective, it would send you back a picture from the collections designed from their data to elicit that response. So I invite you to envision a future where you do your little morning check-in with the bathroom, and it checks all of your stats. And it says, you know what you need to do this morning? You need to look at a Renoir. Well, this is perfectly plausible. We've seen all of the signs that you could do this, but will we actually have a future of integrated health where all of this data that is being harvested and currently used, frankly, to make money for the big companies that create the technology, could be used instead to promote health and well-being and to help people interact with their environments, including museums, in a healthy way? Well, one big concern is privacy. I don't know how about you, but I feel a little concerned about having all my personal health data living somewhere up in the web where it could be hacked. So we may face a future in which many fewer people are willing to wear devices like this. Legislation could be passed saying you can't collect or share this kind of data. Or the whole tech bubble might collapse because a lot of this is speculative. So maybe a lot of the things museums are able to do today because they're essentially free will be very expensive in the future. I'm also using my little device to track my time on this. All right, so let's stop and back up from this future in which health and well-being is dependent on ubiquitous technology and harvesting of data. I always say that anything you can do with technology, with digital technology, you can do with simple human technologies. It may just be harder to scale up, but it may have different meaningful connections. So let's look instead at a potential future in which the dominant theme is human connections. How we relate to each other and how we make each other feel. Well, let's look for little images of how that works now. In a museum, typically people are on their own, but some museums have experimented with giving highly personal guided interactions to their visitors. This is the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, and for a while they provided a personal museum musician. So you could get a headset and plug into the electric guitar that the musician was carrying, and he would follow you around and play music spontaneously designed to align with whatever you were looking at. And I imagine, now I didn't get to do this, I'm very disappointed, but I could imagine you could say, you know, I'm feeling a little down today. Could you give me some upbeat beats so that it would make me feel better? Or, you know, I really need to get a little more grounded. Could we be very calm and contemplative? This is another experiment. This is a group that created a game. I don't know if you'd call it a game, an intervention called artomancy, in which you would have a personal museum guide and muse. So you would go and check out your muse, and you would have a blindfold wrapped around your face, and then you would start walking through the galleries blindfolded. And the muse was there to do two things. First of all, make sure you didn't run into the art. Yay! No running into things. And the other thing that they were there to do was to help you stop and reflect on your personal artomancy journey. So I would be walking with my blindfold, and I would say, I am inspired to stop here. And I would stop, and I would take my blindfold off, and I would see what I was looking at. And in some cases, that was a blank corner or a fire extinguisher. But often, because you're in a museum, it was a work of art or a work of history. And then your guide would help you reflect on what you were looking at and what its personal meaning was to you. It's like a museum tarot deck and how that made you feel, right? To do a little bit of internal excavation of your emotions and draw out how you were reacting to what was in the museum. But you know, it can even be simpler than this. It can just be making sure that people feel welcome in the museum to do things that promote their health and well-being. It can be as simple as inviting people to use your grounds and your building for walking, right? You don't have to be there for the content all the time, though it inevitably seeps in. The Louisville Zoo, for example, has a walking club where people of all ages get together and walk the grounds every morning and say hello to the animals. There's yoga in the galleries. So many museums are now having programs where people are invited in to do guided yoga sessions in the galleries. This is the Rubin Museum of Art, which hosts meditation sessions. And again, this is something I'm seeing in more and more US museums, that either there is a particular room set aside with a specific work of art where people are encouraged to come in and sit and meditate, or there are guided meditation sessions held in the museum's auditorium or in the galleries. Sometimes these programs are very based in data and aimed at particular groups. So for example, there is a whole movement in the US called creative aging that is aimed at helping people who are 55 and older age in ways that are healthy and sustainable, to create social connections, to be active, to be mentally engaged with art making. This is a program on drumming at the Louisiana State Museum in New Orleans. And there is very good data from this long-running program that it does improve people's feelings of well-being, people's feelings of connectedness, the amount of activity they engage in every week, the way they rate the meaningfulness of their lives. This can get even more esoteric. This is an exhibit that was done at the Frye Art Museum that invited in 12 artists who worked with various people in the realm of psychology to do psychotherapy with museum visitors. So you could engage with particular guided activities or sit and talk to somebody about your feelings in the art museum to do a little bit of mental health work in the gallery through the lens of practicing artists. And then sometimes this can go from maintaining health and well-being and creating social connections to actual interventions for people who are having challenges. Many, many museums in the US, and I'm sure it's here true as well, have dementia family support. So this is a program at the Nasher Museum that has worked with the Duke Family Dementia Support Group to bring in groups of people who are suffering from dementia and their caregivers to do memory exercises and feeling exercises in the museum. Again, a lot of research has been done showing this can be beneficial. what are some potential barriers to this human-centered future of health and well-being? Well, for one thing, we may be a barrier to ourselves because museum culture has a very firm idea of what the job is of frontline staff. And that might be to do wayfinding, it might be to do security, it might be to tell people where the bathrooms are when they ask, it may be to give interpretive tours of the art. So it would be a museum cultural shift to say we're going to hire people whose job it is to be the equivalent of the school nurse or the school psychiatrist, to be there to really focus on the individual and attend to how they're feeling and think about how they could interact with the museum in the way that improves their mental health and well-being. And that may require investments in recruitment and training, because maybe we're hiring people with different skills and backgrounds. One of the shifts in the US has been from public libraries just hiring people who are trained as librarians to people who are trained as social workers, because libraries have to deal with a lot of people coming in who are homeless and have significant problems. Maybe museums should start thinking about hiring healthcare workers to work on the front lines or training existing staff. And then a barrier is changing public expectations. Because how do we go from a society in which people think of museums as a place to go for art and history, yay, we've nailed that, or if they have children, a place to go to educate their children, yay, we've nailed that. But how do we change their expectation to one of, I'm not feeling very well today, maybe I should go to the museum because that always lifts my spirits and makes me feel better. All right, I think you're following me on those being plausible futures. But let's go from that to thinking about a future in which the dominant paradigm is integrated systems. Because frankly, I think that it can be very burdensome to think about creating radically different futures where all of the responsibility for that future is on the individual organization. You have to change your operations. You have to change the way you hire and train. You have to change public expectations. It can be enormously difficult to push against the weight of the current system and change it unless we change the whole society around us. So in this future, I want to think about how we integrate what museums do to support health and well-being into the existing systems of care. So let's see what guiding images we can find for what that would look like. Museums are already really good at hosting school field trips. Schools very often think, well, where are we going to take the 4th grade this year to learn about history? Or when are we going to work in art interpretation into the 9th grade curriculum? But we're beginning to see museums say to schools, you can do other things with children as well. This is the Minneapolis Institute of Art, and it gives what it calls empathy tours for school groups. Because one thing kids need is help with their social development, both their own interior emotional well-being and their ability to interact in a productive way with others. So this isn't a way of using art not just to say, here's the artist, how do you read a work of art, but how does this make you feel? How can you use it to connect with other people? How can you use it to improve your social and emotional well-being? I am very encouraged to see that museums are beginning to be formally integrated into healthcare systems, and that's one thing I'm really eager to learn more about from the conference this week. We're beginning to see, in the US, as I know you are as well, museums and groups of physicians in certain areas saying, will the doctor write a prescription for health? Saying, here is a prescription for museum visits. And they are paid for by your health care, so that to help support your mental well-being over the next 2 months, I would like you to make 6 visits to the museum. Here's the prescription, you will get free admission. Again, we're getting wonderful data from these experiments showing that it is effective, so that it can be that doctors have an awareness that museums can support health and well-being, whether it's just through visits or whether it's some of the kinds of programs that we've talked about. The other side of the healthcare system is how we train doctors, because of course if we're ever going to reach a future in which it's normal for doctors to think of museums as part of the health environment, they need to get their training. But again, we've seen very early signals of this. This program, Art of Examination, at the Dallas Museum of Art, is 20 years old. They had begun going to the local medical school and saying, as part of the physician's training, why don't you bring them to the museum? And now we're seeing more programs like this in isolated areas of the US, doing one of two things. Either using the art as a way of physicians maintaining their own mental health and well-being in the challenging task of being a doctor and a caregiver, because that can be tremendously emotionally draining, but also training them in the art of observation, because it turns out that teaching people to look at art is a very effective paradigm for looking at symptoms, for noticing, for diagnosing, for thinking about connections. This is actually also being used to train law enforcement, but that's a whole other issue. It's also being used for stroke rehabilitation. So this is the Cambridge Museums. And what they did is they made digital 3D printed copies of a lot of the natural history objects that they own, including fossils. And they sent collections to local hospitals with training about how to use these for people to feel them and manipulate them and ask questions about them. And it turns out that's very effective for rehabilitation from stroke, to help people to relearn how to use their muscles in handling things and to think carefully about what they're feeling, and also to rehabilitate the areas of their brain for thinking and analysis, and to rehabilitate speech as they're talking to their therapist about what they're feeling and observing about these objects. We're also beginning to see hospitals that actively have art galleries in the hospital. This is a children's hospital with murals from local artists, but the variations on this are endless. It's everything from let's have a separate art gallery in the hospital to let's put art throughout the hospital wings so that as people are moving through corridors, they will be immersed in art. It can even be let's do art exhibits that are created by the staff or created by patients, because there is more and more recognition in hospitals that trying to recover in a sterile and cold environment isn't as effective as having a warm, engaging, intellectually and emotionally supportive visual space. We are also seeing museums begin to be integrated into public spaces. In this case, a major international airport, San Francisco International Airport. Have any of you ever flown into SFO? A couple of hands. Bet you didn't know SFO is an accredited museum. My association, the American Alliance of Museums, is the accrediting body for museums in the US, and we have accredited the airport as a museum because they have over 3,000 works of public art created for the airport by local artists, and they have 15 galleries with exhibits ranging from history to aviation to there's a marvelous exhibit on right now about women and Afrofuturism. Highly recommended if you're flying through to take a look at that. So again, instead of airports being sterile, soul-sucking experiences, they can be exciting places to explore and hang out and learn about history and learn about art while you're having to kill time waiting for your flights. What are some potential barriers to this? And I thought about this a lot because I actually think the systems approach is the most powerful way to make headway in a positive future for museums' health and well-being. And the biggest problem is systems are hard to change because they have inertia. Just when you think about one example, in the US, we have all of this wonderful data about how prescriptions for health can be effective and a very cost-effective way as well. You know, wouldn't an insurance company rather spend money on helping keep you healthy than having to pay to rehabilitate you if you get sick? Yes. But right now in the US, the way that private insurance works makes it very hard to build stable programs like that. So how do you change the system to accommodate these good ideas? And part of that is existing economies and business models. As I said, for example, in the US, the way that insurance is structured makes this difficult, not impossible, but challenging. The other thing is medical schools. If you're trying to change medical training and make it a norm that, of course, you're going to train to be a doctor or a nurse, and part of that training is learning how you could integrate the local museum system into your healthcare, you have to make time for it in the curriculum. And that's a very precious amount of time. So how do you convince the people running a medical school that this is a useful section of the curriculum, or for how you accredit doctors? And then paralleling what I said before, another barrier is the public concept of museum. One of my goals in the US is I envision a future in which any time you sit down to tackle a big public challenge, so like it's a city mayor saying, we're facing the issue of climate change and rising heat. Or you have the local school system saying, we're having a rising dropout rate. How are we going to help keep teenagers engaged in school? Or you're having the local doctors saying, we're having an epidemic of loneliness. How do we make people connect? That one of the first things they think of is, how can we engage the local museum system in helping to solve these problems? I think museums are a tremendous resource for almost any societal issue that you can name, including health and well-being. But we have to have the people who have the responsibility and the power and the resources to tackle those challenges think of us as partners. I'm just curious, because I'd like to follow up on it later. Is there anybody in the audience who isn't from a museum, who is a doctor or a politician or from the local school system? Oh, yay! So some people. I envision a future in which when we have a conference like this, 1 in every 5 people isn't from a museum. They're there to learn how our work can make their work better and more effective. All right. I hope that these glimpses into potential alternate futures have given you some ideas. The takeaways that I want to leave you with is, first of all, the future is diverse. It's not like any one of these stories, just one is going to be true. They could all be true, either in different places, or at different times, or in different mixtures at one time and place. All pieces of all of this could be true. But the other thing is, the most important takeaway is you can influence this future. I like to say, you get where you think you're going, but you have to think about where that is. So I hope that as you suck in all of the good content for the next few days about how museums can do good work in health and well-being, you are formulating in your mind your vision of the preferred future with some very clear images of what that would look like. And when you go back to your institutions, you say, as we make decisions today for what we do, for next year's budget and staffing, for our strategic plan, for our priorities, for what we're going to ask for support from our key partners, what are the things we can do that take us at least one step closer to that vision of the future in which we're playing that role in society? Those are the seeds that you're going to find out there, and that's how you water the seeds. So go back with a clear image of the garden you're trying to create and how you're going to nurture it to grow. Thank you very much.